Our next speaker is Hamish Gordon from Carnegie Mellon, and his title of his talk is How Does Smoke Affect Climate?
Hi, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk about reducing uncertainties in climate models using atmospheric observations and specifically of fires. So I'd like to thank my collaborators at the Center for Atmospheric Particle Studies in CMU and the Department of Statistics and Data Science and at NCSA. So starting from the very beginning, a plot which is hopefully familiar is the latest IPCC assessment of global temperature rises for the next 80 years. And the point I want to make is that there are different scenarios for our future emissions, and associated with each scenario, there is an uncertainty which is associated with our understanding of the climate system. And the uncertainty associated with our understanding of the climate system is shaded for these two scenarios. They didn't want to make the plot too busy, so they only put it for two. And it's large. We don't, if we follow the SSP37 trajectory of CO2 and other emissions, then we could see 3 degrees of warming in 2100, or we could see 5 degrees. And we'd quite like to know, for all sorts of reasons, which one of those it will be. But what I want to talk about is where they get this shading from. So fundamentally, they get this shading by comparing different climate models. And the different climate models produce quite different predictions of global temperatures. The problem with this, and they're well aware of this problem, is that these climate models share a lot of code, they share a lot of assumptions, they share a lot of inputs. Correlations in these uncertainties are a statistician's nightmare, of course. And it leads this uncertainty, these shaded bars are not as robust as we would like. So we'd like to understand complementary approaches to sampling and for predicting the uncertainty in these models. And we can use AI techniques to generate complementary estimates of the uncertainty, or at least to sample different pieces of the uncertainty to the piece that's sampled by comparing different climate models. The different predictions of the IPCC for one particular characteristic are shown here. The effective radiative forcing in watts per square meter is our standard measure of what is driving climate change, the imbalance between radiation coming in and radiation going out of Earth's surface or Earth's atmosphere. Okay, so what causes our uncertainties? Well, we have the scenario uncertainty, which line you follow on the plot I showed you at first, and we have the climate sensitivity, which is responsible for the shaded region. And the only thing I want to say here is that clouds and aerosols are central to the uncertainty in both radiative forcing and climate feedbacks and in scenario uncertainty because of aerosol emissions. It really matters how clouds behave in the next 80 years, and it really matters how clouds have behaved over the industrial period, because clouds are white and the ocean surface is black. So if you change the amount of clouds, you change enormously the amount of radiation that goes back to the sun. So some indication of our uncertainties are shown on the plots here, which give you, at the top right, the radiative drivers of climate change. The greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane, have these very positive warming effects, so the bars go to the right. The aerosol precursors and emissions that affect clouds and aerosols lead to cooling of Earth's atmosphere. And these give you negative, therefore, radiative forcings. And the important thing is that the uncertainty range, or at least our understanding of the uncertainty range, is much larger for the aerosol precursors like SO2. That black bar is much larger than they are for carbon dioxide. And the same is true of our responses to temperature rise. So the climate system responds to temperature rise with climate feedbacks. And again, the largest uncertainty on any of these climate feedbacks is associated with clouds. Part of the reason for this is that we run climate models by dividing the Earth up into many different grid cells, and those grid cells are mostly larger than the size of your average cloud. We can look at the climate models in more detail. They're predicting things like the aerosol life cycle, the effects of clouds on aerosols. We've got all sorts of emissions of aerosols. The one I'm focusing on today is smoke, but there are lots of others. And then we've got removal of aerosols in rain. The climate models are simulating the weather, they're simulating the radiation, they're simulating the aerosols. And one important thing to point out is that it's very common for climate models to do the wrong thing and predict the wrong weather conditions in the present-day atmosphere or predict incorrect concentrations of aerosols. So one thing we can do to make climate models better is improve how well they predict the present-day atmosphere. In other words, we compare them to all sorts of atmospheric observations and try to calibrate them to reproduce these atmospheric observations better. Atmospheric observations can come from satellites. You can see here a satellite picture showing fires detected in Africa by their thermal anomalies, and also showing the clouds in the Southeast Atlantic Ocean that these fires, the smoke from these fires then influences. And we can get all sorts of useful information about the properties of the clouds by more careful wavelength resolved satellite pictures. We're also looking at surface data and aircraft measurements, which give you really detailed in situ pictures of aerosols and clouds, but sampled at much more sparsely. So how do we put these models together with observations to make them better? Well, that's where uncertainty quantification using machine learning algorithms comes into its own. So models have uncertain input parameters, and we know, because, or at least our experts know, more or less what these should be. And we can, for example, fire emissions are uncertain. We detect fires by these thermal anomalies, the red spots on the previous slide, but how much smoke does that red spot correspond to? It could be uncertain by as much as a factor of 2. So the amount of smoke could be scaled up or down within its uncertainty range. We've got other parameters, for example, determining the properties of clouds. We can scale those up and down within their uncertainty range. We end up with a 50-dimensional space of 50 parameters with, and we sample that space sparsely with our quite expensive climate model in order to map out how the climate model responds across that space of uncertain parameters. So this is a technique which has been applied in many different areas, and we can then, sampling our multidimensional uncertainty response space with our climate model is fine. That tells us something. But then we can use Gaussian process emulation to interpolate across the response space of the model and infer the model response, the radiative balance, at any point in that space, whether that we have some kind of observation for, or that we want to identify how the model will respond for any given combination of our input parameters. So that emulator uses this Gaussian process emulation technique. We can test this, and then we can explore which model parameters, whether the smoke emissions, whether the cloud properties, are more important to determining the overall uncertainty in the radiative balance that we get from the climate model. Also, we can do a procedure known as history matching, originally developed in the energy industry, to constrain the model and make it better, essentially, to reduce the uncertainty in those input parameters by sampling the outputs. And then we hope to make sharper predictions of future temperatures. And smoke is one key element of this because it's a very large source of aerosol, and it's one of the main drivers of our uncertainty, as I discussed before. So the history matching algorithm, I want to go into a little bit more detail on this. Essentially, we have millions of observations in principle, and we can make use of as many of them as we have time to process. And for each observation, we have a corresponding prediction from the model and an uncertainty which we can derive in, I won't go into the details of the uncertainty, but we get an implausibility. We get a measure of how good the model prediction is for that observation. Then the next step is to figure out whether or not to accept or reject a model variant, a combination of input parameters that has a certain implausibility. And this is something where there's some subjectivity. We can't rule out our entire parameter space because that would lead us with a useless result. But if we insist that every model point agrees with an observation perfectly, then that's what we'd end up doing. So there is some subjectivity here, and plenty of scope for clever statistical techniques to reduce that subjectivity. So we're investigating a threshold and tolerance for determining these implausibilities, as shown on the slide. This has been done fairly recently for two observables, aerosol optical depth and particulate matter concentrations at the surface, for which we have a lot of measurements. Before the constraint on the model, we predicted the black probability distributions that you can see here over the uncertainty space that we put into the model. And the observation of the aerosol optical depth in this case was the green dashed line. We can tighten that. We can reject the implausible models in this part of the PDF here, and we're left with the red and blue lines, depending on how we do the constraint. So we've tightened that. And the overall result is that after doing that, one can make some improvement to the predictions of the model. So on this plot at the bottom left, you can see that the unconstrained radiative forcing from aerosol cloud interactions, so that's aerosols acting as the seeds of cloud droplets, didn't change very much. So it wasn't successful there. But aerosol scattering radiation, aerosol radiation interactions, we have a black PDF before the constraint and a red one afterwards, and you can see that the width of the PDF has gone down. We've constrained the model and successfully reduced the uncertainty. And there's a huge amount of scope to improve on this with more diverse observations and more measurements, focusing on different aspects like fires, and that's what we're doing in this C3 project. So you can also see uncertainties in the input parameters are constrained as well, but I don't have time to go into those. So just to summarize the problem, we then have about 10 observables now instead of 2, 50 climate model parameters, 200 to 300 simulations, and we can emulate our model grid cells over the 50-dimensional input space to determine the uncertainty contributed by our uncertain parameters and to constrain the model to the uncertain observations. And after that, because we do this in every model box in 3 dimensions across the Earth's surface, there'll be all sorts of interesting machine learning approaches to cluster together the model output in physical space and understand which parameters matter where and so on. And this is going to be really exciting later on. So far, we've developed and maybe I'm taking a risk in actually showing you code, but we've developed a promising proof of principle Gaussian process emulator for black carbon mass. Black carbon's obviously a key constituent of smoke. And over our 221 input simulations, you can see that the emulator gives a reasonably good correlation with an R-squared of 0.75 to the input simulations. We need to improve on this further, but it's proof of principle. It does the job. And this is all done in the C3 infrastructure as shown in my snippets. Similarly, we can also compare the raw model outputs to the observations. We haven't quite got to doing the emulated model output yet. And you can see here's our observation of our black carbon. The PDF of the model's simulations, the raw model simulations, is shown in blue. And the question is then which ones to keep and which ones to rule out. Okay, so just to summarize, it's increasingly important to explore uncertainty in future temperature predictions and in climate models with complementary approaches so that we can explore the parts of the uncertainty that are not sampled by the IPCC's approaches. We can do Gaussian process emulation with machine learning to quantify these uncertainties and history matching. There's plenty of scope for new statistical and machine learning research. And we're applying this to constrain the global radiative effects of smoke in this project. So I'd like to thank the DTI, particularly the DevOps team, who have been extremely helpful in getting the infrastructure going, and my collaborators again. And I'd like to go back a slide for the questions, if that's possible. Thank you.
Maybe have time for like half a question. If not, let's thank the speaker one more time.
So, so Gaussian process is certainly a fine choice, so don't get me wrong. But what made you converge on Gaussian processes rather than something else? So, say a deep neural network or something. So what went into that choice?
So, I mean, that's an interesting question. There are lots of approaches that we could use. You're perfectly correct with that. It's a lot, interpolating across a high-dimensional parameter space with machine learning is a well-known problem. We like Gaussian processes because we can understand what they're doing quite well, and they're kind of simple. More or less. I would say that's the key reason. I mean, we might have to do some research to see whether they actually give the best performance. To my knowledge, that hasn't been done for this problem yet. So that's an interesting thing to pursue further. Thank you.
Thank the speaker one more time.